Carnival of Monsters, the second serial of Doctor Who's 10th season, first broadcast in 6 parts from the 27th of January to the 17th of February 1973. Now, this was always an odd story for me looking in because, to my mind, this is on a ship in the middle of the ocean with sea monsters. So, how does the carnival fit in with it? How does that make any sense? I also It's also a story that I did see bits and pieces of. For example, there's an episode of the first season of the CBBC show Danny's House where you can see the two aliens at the beginning. They're actually watching Carnival of Monsters. It's one that I knew bits and pieces of, but I didn't really see how it could entirely fit together. However, watching it through, I do think it does all fit together, and I think it's an enjoyable story. I mean, as with modern Who, you get the pieces which are supposed to be the kind of big, flashy stuff, and then you got the kind of the smaller fluff pieces. Like, the big, flashy stuff which is supposed to build lore and everything is something like The Stolen Earth. Whereas the more fluff pieces is something like The Unicorn, the Wasp. Which is a lot more scaled down and a bit more fluffy. This is definitely more a fluff piece, but that doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. So the Doctor, played by, at this point, John Pertwee, and his companion Jo Grant, played by Katie Manning. At the end of the previous story, The Three Doctors, the Doctor finally managed to get control of his TARDIS back. The Time Lords granted him a new materialization circuit, and he can now go flying off around the universe. So they make an attempt to get to the planet of Metebelis 3, which is, of course, the planet that the Third Doctor would ultimately meet his maker on in Planet of the Spiders. But enough about that. They make an attempt to get there, but instead end up on a ship in the middle of the ocean. A ship heading to Bombay. Now, the ship is called the SS Bernice. And while the SS Bernice in our world is completely fictional, the Doctor says to Jo that at one point the SS Bernice was as famous as the Mary Celeste. In 1926 it was making a journey across to Bombay. But then something happened and the ship disappeared. Now the ship is manned by several characters, which include Major Daly, played by Tenny Elevens, who was kind of like an old kind of colonel type. His daughter, Claire Daly, played by Janie McCracken, who's definitely again more the flapper girl type, and she's having somewhat of a relationship with a lieutenant aboard the ship called Lieutenant John Andrews, played by Ian Marter. Now, Ian Marter, from what I've heard, he was apparently one of the names considered for the part of Mike Yates in Doctor Who, but he sadly had to turn it down due to a prior engagement. However, later on, for series 12, 1975 and onwards, they asked him if he wanted to come back and play Harry Sullivan. So yeah, he came back for it. But this is actually his first role in the show, Lieutenant John Andrews, and I think he plays it pretty well. I mean, as he's kind of being controlled later on, you can see that he is a nice man, but then he does have his limits. Now, the thing about everyone aboard the SS Bernice is that they seem to be living in the loop. We see one moment of them coming in, the daughter saying, "Oh, we're going off for a walk around the ship, do you want to come with us?" And her dad going, "No, I think I'm just going to stay behind and read my last 2 chapters." And then they set off, and then suddenly a sea monster appears, and then all of a sudden they're back at that moment saying, "Oh, we're going to go for a walk," as if no one really understands what's going on. Now, it turns out that the SS Bernice and the kind of sea monsters outside, which are known as the Drashigs, they are inside a miniscope, and the miniscope is the property of a man named Vorg, played by Leslie Dwyer. Now, Vorg and his kind of partner in crime, Sherna, played by Cheryl Hall, they are entertainers, more or less. They're kind of carnival workers, and they've just arrived on a planet called Intermina, and they're essentially stuck at airport customs. Like, they have to kind of get through it, but then the Interminers are being rather, shall we say, difficult to work with. I mean, the residents of Intermina, they're germophobic, they're overly political, and the 3 main ones that we focus on the story are one named Calic, played by Michael Wisher, Aurum, played by Terence Lodge, and Pletrak, played by Peter Halliday. We do see that they are germophobic, they are kind of overly political, and they are very kind of Spock-minded, thinking things that are only logical. To which Vorg has to show off his miniscope in order to show them what it is and try and get it through kind of basically the airport. But then two members of the Interminers named Kalik and Aurum are planning. One of the things that Vorg has within the miniscope are Drashigs, which are kind of like big monster creatures, which are actually pretty cool. However, Kalik and Aurum are seemingly trying to take advantage of it to release the Drashigs onto Interminer to kill the current president so that they can maneuver someone else in there, and it does get a little overly political, which is okay. I mean, the story, as I said, it's a good fluff piece. I mean, after the kind of hugeness of scale that was the Three Doctors, it is nice to see something a little bit more smaller scale. I mean, the monsters are evidently CG, or to at least certain parts of them, and it is a little bit odd. I mean, it's a shame we don't get to see more of the creatures. I mean, all we really get to see is the head, or the neck and the head upwards, which, granted, is all you really need for a sea monster, but I think they could have done a bit more with it. But they do manage to sell it that it is legitimately frightening, and you also get Joe's frustration later on with the kind of loopingness, as at one point she and the Doctor get separated, and while the Doctor's going off inside the miniscope to try and fix things, she has to find a way to get back to him, but in doing so she ends up continually getting caught, and it's continually being taken to a cabin and escapes using the skeleton keys, and then they're like, hold on, who are you? Where are you going? It's like, we've just been through all this, which is kind of nice to see. Now, I do also like at the end how, in the end, everything gets sorted out, and while the miniscope itself gets emptied and destroyed and everyone gets sent back to their proper times, it is nice to see that Vorg and Shona do get away. I mean, while this is entirely their fault, you do get the sense that they didn't necessarily want anything bad to happen. They were just showmen. They were just trying to show off. They were just trying to be entertainers. And even though this all had an unfortunate circumstance, they weren't really to blame. So it is nice to see at the end, when they finally get everything sorted, Vorg manages to use a Carnival trick on one of the Interminers, saying, now, these three shells, can you guess which one the pebble is under? Okay, shift them around, And it's nice to see that he does still maintain that. Now, this was also an important story kind of later on down the line, as in the 12th Doctor story, Robot of Sherwood, he does bring up, after meeting Robin Hood, like, well, we could be in a miniscope. Which is, it's nice to see Doctor Who hark back to later stories like this. I mean, as I said, I don't necessarily think Carnival of Monsters is the greatest story in Doctor Who's catalogue, but you know what? After the kind of bigness of the Three Doctors, and a little bit of time before the Green Death came along to signal the departure of Joe Grant, it is nice to have these little fluff pieces that aren't necessarily meant to be taken that seriously, but are just great fun to watch. So, it won't further your understanding if you do skip this one, but if you get a chance, I definitely suggest checking out Carnival of Monsters. Now, the next and final story for a while that I'm going to be reviewing of Classic Who is The Resurrection of the Daleks from the Fifth Doctor. What do I think of that? Well, we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, until then, see ya.